Hi, I'm Dr. Sarita Jackson, President and CEO of the Global Research Institute of International Trade. I am excited here to discuss in this current election year what the 2020 presidential elections will mean for importers and exporters. I was asked that question similar to 4 years ago about what are some of the policies or what can we expect, what have been the results with the current administration, and then is international trade being discussed in the current political climate, and then what can we expect? So that's where I'm going to talk about what has been going on, what some of the results are, and again, this is a nonpartisan, fact-based discussion just to present the information, and then it's up to you as the importer, the exporter, the business owner, if you have clients that are in the import-export space to make a final decision. And if you have any additional questions, to reach out to me. You can always reach out to me through direct messaging on social media or the email grit@grit.org for any questions that you may have. But again, today's focus is on what the 2020 U.S. elections will mean for importers and exporters. So I just want to show some figures as in terms of what things have looked like when it comes to trade in goods. Now, why do I focus mainly on trade in goods? The reason being is when we go back 4 years ago during the 2016 presidential elections, international trade was a major issue, really received a lot of attention, and the focus was on the manufacturing sector, the argument to boost U.S. manufacturing, increase production here in the United States, which would benefit manufacturing companies and workers in that particular sector, as well as to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. So I'm focusing on trade in goods. Trade in services, the United States has a surplus in trade in services, which doesn't receive as much attention, but nonetheless, when I work with business owners, especially those in the service sector, I identify the opportunities for them to reach other markets and be competitive, since we are competitive in that particular space. But with trade in goods, the focus was to reduce the U.S. trade deficit. So as we can see here, that trade in goods looking just at 2 different years, 2017 and last year in 2019, what the trends were. So when it comes to import and export in the year 2017, we see where the imports, meaning how much of goods the United States actually purchases and brings in, outpaces the exports. U.S. imports in 2017 reached $2.4 trillion compared to $1.5 trillion of exports, of how much of our goods we are actually sending to the overseas market. So there is a trade deficit and imbalance where the imports outweigh the exports. And the same when we look at the imports from 2017 and 2019, the imports actually increased from $2.4 trillion in 2017 to $2.6 trillion in 2019. And in 2019 here to the right, where again there is an imbalance between the imports and the exports. We imported last year $2 trillion worth of goods, while we only exported $1.6 trillion worth of goods. And when we look at the exports in 2019 compared to 2017, our exports increased only slightly from $1.5 trillion in 2017 to $1.6 trillion in 2019. As a result, we have a trade deficit for both years, and that actually increased. In 2017, the trade deficit was $859 billion. By 2019, that increased to $923 billion. And remember, again, the whole focus of talking about the manufacturing sector, trade in goods, generally speaking, was to reduce this trade deficit. But the reverse actually happened. The trade deficit in goods actually increased. And when I'm talking about imports and exports, I'm talking about the U.S. trade balance with the world, with all of the countries, not just one or two countries. So that's where we stand as a result of, or just the results from the last few years. Now, what's going on in 2020? Because this year, as we all know, has been a completely different year. We've had the global health pandemic, but also when I talk about the trade balance, it's not just as a result of the global health pandemic in terms of its impact on international trade, but also with our policies looking at the U.S.-China trade war, phase one of a trade deal that took effect. So let's look at what happened just this year, where we are. So again, sticking with trade in goods, in January and July of 2020, July 2020, that according to our research, the research that GRIIT has conducted, we see that looking at the month of January alone compared to the month of July alone, that we see that we're in the same predicament. That in the month of January of 2020, that the imports outpaced the exports, that we imported $202 billion worth of goods compared to $129 billion worth of U.S. exports to the global market. Moving down some months later, by the end of this summer, looking at the month of July alone, that the imports also increased a little bit compared to January. We imported $207 billion worth of goods compared to $113 billion worth of exports in goods. And when we look at the July figures for exports alone, that our exports actually dropped. We exported less in the month of July compared to January. Nevertheless, same predicament in the first 7 months of this year, that we still have a trade deficit, and just looking at it at a month-to-month level, that we see in January that we had a $73 billion trade deficit, and by the month of July, that trade deficit, just for that month alone, was actually higher at $94 billion. So those are the results, just so that you know, okay, well, what has the impact, as opposed to just having a discussion, a broad-based discussion and a lot of rhetoric, just to show you the numbers, and particularly for those businesses that are actually importing and exporting goods, that you can see exactly what the results have been. And I'm going to pick up on last night's debate, but before I even get to last night's presidential debate, I want to talk about, I've shown you the numbers, look at some of the policies that we've seen and that have that one can argue actually contributed to some of the results that we are seeing. Not definitive, but at least so that we can put it into context in terms of what types of policies were put in place during the times, during the period or the time frame that I talked about, showing you what the results were, particularly with trade in goods. So when it comes to our policies, when I talk about policies, mainly looking at our trade agreements, our trade programs that are designed to liberalize trade, encourage trade between the United States and other countries or territories. So what we've seen in the last few years was, one, that the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which we did sign with 11 other countries throughout the Asia-Pacific region. But under the current administration, we withdrew. So that, well, let me just say this. A number of countries we already have access to that were a part of the TPP. For example, the NAFTA countries now under the USMCA, which I'll talk about, but Mexico and Canada. We've already had have an agreement with them prior to USMCA taking effect this year. It was under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So we had some countries with which we already signed a trade deal. But with the TPP, it did increase access to some other markets that we do not have a bilateral or any kind of cross-regional trade agreement with. So that's the downside of no longer having access to those markets. But again, that's where more in-depth economic analysis will really determine, well, is it really a loss, so on and so forth, or the true impact. But nonetheless, just broadly speaking, that not continuing and moving forward with the TPP, then that reduces our access in the Asian market. And considering everything that's going on this year, when we talk about supply chain diversification, that's where a number of companies are trying to identify other markets throughout the Asian region where they can do business, considering because of the U.S.-China trade war. Okay, but many of those countries moved on, and they signed, the other 11 countries, and signed the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the other countries moved on even after the United States withdrew. Then secondly, the USMCA that I just referenced briefly, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. That is an agreement that basically upgraded or modernized the North American Free Trade Agreement, especially when it comes to digital trade and in other areas, automobile sector and labor, where some rules have been enhanced, if you will. The agricultural sector mainly opening up the market even more for U.S. dairy producers, for the Canadian market. So there are different unique or enhancements in the agreement. So that was signed in 2018, took effect in July 1st of this year. So that's a really good thing, because that maintains our supply chains here just within the North American region alone that were enhanced as a result of NAFTA taking effect in 1994. So now here we are in 2020. At least we maintain those supply chains and just basically enhancing many of the rules that govern trade. And then also, as I said earlier, modernizing the agreement to take into account the digital trade. So that's another thing with this particular administration that we've seen in the last few years. And then the U.S.-China trade war has been a top issue within the international trade community. And as January of this year, phase 1 of a U.S.-China trade deal took effect. So that's what we've seen policy-wise. Then when we look at the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, that I'm just going to briefly summarize some of his points that you can get from his website, joebiden.com, and then transition into what we heard in last night's presidential debate. But there are just several points from Biden's website where in terms of his plan when it comes to international trade, is just basically rebuilding U.S. domestic manufacturing, strengthening the supply chains for critical products, securing those supply chains. And that was mainly because of what we saw happen this year, especially when it came to medical equipment. When the global health pandemic really hit, the United States took notice and really started really focusing on the pandemic in areas of getting PPEs, personal protective equipment, pharmaceuticals, things like that. And if you recall, we were at a huge shortage when it came to especially when it came to PPEs, where many of the hospitals, the hospital workers did not have access to this type of equipment. So when it comes to strengthening supply chains, securing supply chains, making sure that we have access to these critical products in a time of need, and making sure that they are safe, because that was another issue that came about. And I remember also working in that particular space where people approached me on the PPE side and having to really learn quite quickly to notice, well, is this an approved, are the products that we are looking at, are they produced by approved manufacturers, so on and so forth, to make sure that you're not dealing with something that really is going to do more harm than good. Also, in terms of Joe Biden's stance enforcing trade rules, that's another issue. I'll talk about that. And then again, expanding markets for U.S. products, focusing on buying American-made products, and then also expanding the markets, getting our products into other markets. So that's what we saw. So some of this is we heard very briefly. There was a short time where international trade did come up during last night's presidential debate, the second presidential debate. And so it emerged out of the questions pertaining to China. So this is what came out from the debate, and then I'm just going to talk about the results, what we've seen in terms of our global economy, or the U.S. role in international trade, or what it has meant for U.S. companies, U.S. producers, and so on and so forth. So when it came to steel, during the discussion about China, steel was mentioned, about the 25% tariff that has been placed on steel imports that were dumped. The term was used, dumped, in other words, sent to the United States and sold at below market value, which is considered an illegal trade practice, not just here in the United States, but according to rules set by the World Trade Organization. So that was mentioned last night, this 25% tariff placed on steel imports from China on set by the United States. And as a result of that, these are the results. Just briefly looking at a report by the International Trade Administration within the U.S. Department of Commerce, is that U.S. imports of steel from China steel decreased 22.4% from May to June of 2020. So we saw a decrease in imports from May to June of this year alone. However, production this year also decreased by 3.4%, decreased by June of 2020. So that's just to give you a sense, and again, without much getting into the politics of it, but just so that you can make a decision based on this is what the policies were, the initial goals and objectives, and then this is where we are. Also, when it comes to farmers, that was mentioned about farmers and the U.S. relationship with China and how that benefited farmers. Well, I'm just going to talk about the phase one of the trade deal that took effect this year. Well, according to a Fortune magazine article published this year, published in October, so this month, that the goal was to have China actually purchase $22.3 billion worth of agricultural products from the United States. So where do we stand? By August of 2020, China had only purchased $9.6 billion. So here, let me just move so you can see here. So that with farmers, the purchases were less than 50%, at least where we are up until August, of the initial goal. So that's where we stand. And then trade rule enforcement is another issue that came up during the presidential debate, where the argument, at least by Biden, was that he mentioned how under the Obama administration, they also supported the steel tariffs, and these were tariffs actually through a ruling from the WTO that allowed the United States to place tariffs on steel imported from China. So looking at least that record, we see that it supports some of what he is talking about when it comes to trade rule enforcement, that when our trade partners do not play by the rules, they violate the rules of international trade or any agreements, that there will actually be consequences. So just watch out for that, because when it comes to trade rule enforcement, and especially in recent years, that has been an issue more so and this is beyond the U.S. presidential debate, but when it comes to the World Trade Organization and what they have called a dispute settlement mechanism to to enforce the ability for the dispute settlement mechanism to enforce trade rules and make sure that all of its members abide by those rules, and when they do not, that there are consequences. But it's not just consequences in writing, that they are actually enforced. So that's something just to watch out as a producer, as an importer or an exporter, even though this is a policy-based discussion. These are policies that have an impact on you. So don't think that these are just discussions that are taking place amongst the government. Rather, these policies are what have an impact on your ability to compete globally or even in your home market for that matter. So just to wrap up, to summarize, okay, the key takeaways. So I've talked about what the results have been, particularly for those that produce goods, not necessarily on the services side. What we have seen, looked at some of the policies that have taken effect in the last few years under the current administration. Now, what to look forward to in the remaining months of 2020 as you are planning, hopefully you are planning for 2021. Because as I say, even though there are unplanned, uncertain times, what is certain is that this is the time to plan. So having information, following the trends, being prepared for whichever way things can go will help you to be competitive. So let's look at some of the things for importers and exporters just to watch out for in the remaining months, and as we wrap up our here in the United States presidential election cycle. So for importers, U.S. importers, I talked about this in an earlier GRIIT Group Live, my Facebook Live session, about a trade agreement, not a trade agreement, a trade program that is set to expire at the end of this year. That's the generalized systems of preferences. And there have been strong critiques against reauthorizing the generalized systems of preferences, or GSP, as well as those that support it. It is set to expire the end of this year. Go back if you can, and it's also on the YouTube channel. Watch that video where I go into more detail about that, what it means for the importers, especially those importers that benefit from importing products from eligible, GSP eligible countries, developing countries mostly, developing countries, least developed countries, that they're able, U.S. importers are able to bring in goods from those countries and eligible products duty free. So watch out for that. Stay focused on what is going on with the GSP so that if it is not reauthorized, you can be prepared for next year. Then secondly, the trade rules. Again, and that's that the trade rules, just basically any kind of unfair trade practices that may hurt your particular industry as an importer, to follow what those rules are, because either it can hurt your industry or hurt you in the sense of if there are trade rules that are enforced that allows the United States to place high tariffs on certain goods, and if you're an importer of those goods, well, that has an impact on your bottom line, because now your cost of importing those goods can go up. So follow what the trade rules are, what's going on with the policy, whether it can be an increase in tariffs, or if we have policies such as the USMCA, where you can import goods from markets. Well, the USMCA just is, as I said, a revised version of NAFTA, but any additional trade agreements that are coming down the pipeline that allows you to import from other markets duty-free or at a lower duty cost, depending on what the product is and what the rules are within that particular agreement. And then lastly, just one thing to watch is the US-UK agreement. Once we moved into the post-Brexit phase, the United States and the UK began negotiations for a trade agreement. And it has faced challenges, so we'll see what happens, and that may depend on the outcome of the elections, at least according to the latest reports that I've read. So just follow that. If you're interested in the UK market, that's something to follow. For exporters, the main thing also, the USMCA, US exporters, to see how you can take advantage if you're not already integrated into the Canadian and Mexican market, how you can take advantage of the revised version of NAFTA now under the USMCA. Then the same thing, to look at the trade rules, the rules within any kind of trade agreement that can have an impact on your access, your ability to compete in other markets. So to follow that regularly, and then also to look at the US-UK, just what's going on. Again, the negotiations began earlier this year. They face challenges, but nonetheless, just follow what's going on, what the key issues are, and how that agreement, if there's any information publicly available that relates to your particular industry, your particular product, and follow that if you're interested in the UK market, because should the agreement take effect, that can be another opportunity for you to enter the UK market. So that's it in terms of my analysis of what has been going on results-wise, and then looking at last night's second presidential debate and what it means for you as an importer or an exporter. Again, I am Dr. Sarita Jackson, President and CEO of the Global Research Institute of International Trade, where we work with clients to do up-to-date, customized market research and develop a strategy for our clients with our network of trusted advisors as they implement our strategy. So if you have a question about what is going on with the current election or any of the policies that I've talked about to watch out for as we go toward the end of this year, feel free to send me an email at GRIIT with 2 I's, GRIIT @grit.org, or just contact me on social media. You can always post a question in the comments wherever you see this video, or send me a direct message. So thank you for watching. If you loved this video, found the information helpful, please go ahead and share this information. Follow me on social media. You can go to my website. You'll see all of my social media pages, grit.org, GRIIT.org, and you'll have access to all of my social media pages. And please go ahead, follow, and share this information with others. Thank you, and have a great day. Bye-bye.